have to be honest and say when I first saw Another Crab's Treasure as a Souls-like, I thought it was simply a novelty, a reskin of a game I've played several times before. And I probably owe developer Aggro Crab an apology for that assumption. Not only does it stand on its own 10 legs, it innovates in a number of key areas. I'm guessing you're interested like I was in the Nintendo Switch version specifically, so do watch the entire review and the performance section. Is it king of the beach? Or does it just skim the surface? Well, my name's Mark Walker, welcome back to SwitchUp, now let's find out. The star of the show is Krill, a hermit crab who simply wants to be left alone. He's an introvert that doesn't like crowds and would rather while away his days chilling out in his shell. Unfortunately, a loan shark has other ideas. When he pays Krill a visit, informing him that he's not paid any of his taxes and then yoinks his shell away. The rest of the narrative centers around you trying to get that shell back and takes you throughout many different locations under the seas. They range from the lush shallows to caverns and even a vast city. One of the most surprising things about Another Crab's Treasure is just how big the world is, albeit not entirely open with loading areas. Gameplay wise, well, there's so much to get into, and there's so much good to talk about. You control Krill as you would with a Souls-like, although there is an option for those who aren't familiar with the genre to control it in a more classic 3D platformer style. For me though, I am definitely familiar with the genre, meaning you can lock on to enemies, you attack with the R bumper button, and you hold it down to perform a more powerful one. Your trusty weapon here is an old fork, which can later be upgraded using microplastics, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the combat involves dodging around, rolling, and refreshingly there isn't a stamina bar. Instead you'll be relying on your shell. Now you begin the game without any shell at all because yours has been nicked, but quite quickly you'll start to discover new ones. I absolutely love the way you crawl into these. They have different statistics and also different weights, ranging from small, medium and large. This will affect the speed at which you can dodge and roll around, and they have different levels of resilience. A thimble's a little bit more sturdy than, say, a banana skin, for example. But that's not the best bit, as you're gonna see. Now, there's a magic system that you unlock quite early in the game via the friendly and quite sardonic moon snail who likes to talk about you in the third person when you're stood right in front of him, and this is known as Umami. You have a number of charges, they recharge over time, but here's the cool bit. Every single shell in the game has its own special skill, and they're all completely different. One of them will have spikes come out of a glass. Another one, like the Yakult, yeah, that's definitely not its name for copyright reasons, that will heal you over time. It means that choosing your shell is more than just how much defense they offer. This was a really clever idea, especially combined with some of the skill upgrades. Now you unlock the skill tree quite early as well, and you'll find various Umami crystals hidden throughout the world, or by defeating the enemies with the glowing purple eyes. And you can spend this currency to upgrade a number of different areas, unlocking things like the parry, the riposte, and that's where the combat begins to get really interesting, because if you can parry and riposte correctly, you can actually completely avoid any damage to your shell. The shell's durability is how many hits it can essentially take before it falls apart, leaving you exposed. During fights, you'll need to jump into other shells that you find around. And then you've got your boss fights. Now, it wouldn't be any type of Souls-like without boss combat, and some of these are quite tough. The unique mechanic that applies here is the balance and capsize system. Now, any Souls-like usually has, behind the scenes, a system whereby you do enough damage, you can stagger and knock down your enemies. Here, just below the health bar, you can see another yellow bar. Once that's maxed out by repeatedly hitting the enemy, if you then perform a powerful attack by holding the button down, they can be toppled, leaving them open to massive damage. Now, although I mentioned the parry system, I didn't tell you how it works. This is also almost the opposite of every other game. Rather than press the block button just as you're attacked, you have to release it, which makes sense, right? You're a crab popping out of your shell at just the right moment. It takes a bit of getting used to, but once you do, it feels really natural. And the positive side effect of it is, if you time it right, then obviously you get your parry, and if you don't, you tend to immediately press the shell again and can very often get back under cover, because the controls are very responsive. Blocks are instantaneous. The funny thing with Another Crab's Treasure is how much it plays into the idea of microplastics within the sea. Rather than simply barrage the player with how much damage humanity are doing to this ecosystem, instead what it does is cleverly create a very human reaction to this invasion of plastics. That being greed. Everyone wants these plastic particles. It's seen as treasure within this world. They fight over it, they argue over it, but unbeknownst to them, it's also toxic. What that means is your currency within the game is actually microplastic. Every time you kill an enemy, you gain this, and it can be found all over the place. Those microplastics are what you'll use when you reach a save point. Now, not bonfires, but instead large shells which you can enter into, and the most familiar aspect being that when you do this, all the enemies will respawn, and also you can spend that microplastic to level up in a number of different areas. It's from these shells that you'll also fast travel between any locations you've previously visited, and that's probably a good time to talk about the insurance system. Now, when you reach the first major city, quite a few new mechanics are introduced, one of those being insuring your shells. Every single shell you ever wear in the game is saved within a list. What you can do then is actually insure it so that when you die you can respawn with a shell of your choosing. It costs quite a substantial amount, but gives you a significant advantage, especially later in the game. If another Crab's Treasure simply had all the elements I've spoken about already, then it would already be a very good game. However, it goes quite a few steps further. Platforming is handled brilliantly. Very early you gain a fish hook, which lets you grapple to high locations. This is facilitated by your slightly mediocre swimming ability, which allows you to slow your fall and struggle swim your way towards an edge. There are times where the platforming could have you fall to your death, and I was really pleased that you don't actually die under these situations, you just lose a chunk of health. It really feels like every aspect of its design is a thought through decision. That's never more evident than when you've climbed to the top of the castle and you lower your first shortcut hook. They don't want to waste anyone's time here. And it shows in every mechanic. Whatever you're doing, you will be having to think about your health. Your character has heart kelps. These can also be permanently increased if you find the prerequisite item within the world, usually hidden away. But if you do die, all of your microplastics will be dropped on the ground, as will your current shell. You'll have to retrieve those manually, and if you die again, well, they'll be gone forever. Navigation is excellent. There are a couple of nice things. Firstly, you've got a map, which makes good sense. You've got a compass, which makes it easy to go in the right direction. And a nice little touch is the loading screens are used to show you where you last were, so if you die, just having those few seconds to take a look is really useful. Another Crab's Treasure is an outstandingly good game. From the voice acting to the characterization, to the nuance within combat, the shell system, and the controls themselves. Unfortunately, the Switch version is let down in both gameplay and controls because, as I'm sure you've seen, some of the performance is substandard to the detriment of the player, especially on some of the bosses, as we'll go into. Even with that said, the game is so good that it deserves a high score in gameplay and controls. I give gameplay 18 out of 20. Controls have to take a bigger hit. They score 17 out of 20. Let's rip the band-aid off, shall we? The Nintendo Switch version has bad performance in some areas. It targets 30 frames per second. It can do that for some of the time. It's also very responsive, so the input latency is very low, and that's ideal. Sadly, if you're someone that plays a lot in handheld, both the performance and the visuals are much worse in this mode. Now, the developer and publisher, they said they're patching the game substantially, but obviously this is the launch day version of the game. I've completed the game on PlayStation 5, so the version you're getting is the one I'm playing. And yeah, you do need to know, if you're a handheld player, it's just not great right now. If you're playing docked, visually it looks better. It can maintain that frame rate certainly more consistently than when you're playing in handheld. More than enough for me to enjoy it in this way, but you can definitely see the issues that they're working on. When you transition to a new area, for example, there are some big 2, 3, 4 second long pauses while it loads, and then it all catches up and it's generally okay. As for the artistic quality, well, I think it's brilliant. There's so many details here. From things like when you pause and leave the controller alone for a while, the character will take up one of those kelp and start to juggle with it. But then when you move the controller, he obviously loses his balance and then drops the kelp, and you have to go pick it up again. The environments themselves also have a lot of detail, things like fish swimming past. Those different shells all look completely unique and have their own special effects tied to them. But on Switch, yes, you've got pop-in, yep, you've got lower resolution textures, and as far as resolution goes, well, handheld, very low indeed. And in docked, it looks to be using FSR, but with the telltale crosshatch that you see when it's trying to upscale from a very low resolution image. With that said, I think it does hold up at times. Sound and audio are outstanding. Every little detail has a sound effect attached to it. Different surfaces that you tread on will also sound unique, but it's the music that was most surprising. When you hear the term Souls-like, you don't really expect some of these lovely melodic tunes. But what's clever is how they shift both the visual and the audio palette to match the corruption that's taking place behind the scenes, caused by, yep, you guessed it, us. There are other nice little touches, like in the menus, hints, but also facts about the ocean. Now, visuals and performance on Switch, it goes without saying, they're not quite good enough. They score 10 out of 20. Sound and audio, outstanding. That scores 19 out of 20. Another Crab's Treasure is going to set you back currently £24.29 with a 10% discount, but it retails at £26.99. And as far as I can see, there isn't a physical available at the moment. For that price, you're getting a vast Souls-like experience with a completely unique twist. It will take you around about 20 or 30 hours to finish it. The biggest issue is that Switch performance in handheld mode, but I have zero doubts in this instance that patches in the next weeks will have this running perfectly. Of course, if you'd rather wait and see, then make sure you subscribe for our All Patched Up series. Even as it stands, I think this offers good value for money, and I give value 16 out of 20. If Another Crab's Treasure was performing right, this would easily be one of my highest scores of the year. It's certainly one of my favourite games of it. Right now in its current state, it gets a SwitchUp score of 80%. Thanks to all of you that enjoy the content, I hope this was useful. You could probably hear how much I love this one. It's incredibly good fun. But yeah, it's getting a bit frustrating, isn't it, with these Switch releases? Thank you to our Patreons and members, all of you that enjoy the content, and as always, for all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!